My name is Jessica Olsey, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Institute of International Studies. Moderating today, we will have our faculty co-director, Daniel Sargent, Professor of History and Public Policy. And this is the third installment in a spring speaker series that was actually first conceptualized by our senior fellow, Bennett Freeman, who just stepped out but is also here today. And so his vision was to look at all the kind of rupturing that is happening in different domains. So we've had sessions on kind of what support looks like for global democracy and human rights. And then we had a session on international security. And today we're talking about trade. We'll also go into a little bit about economic policy and monetary policy, climate policy. So you'll see how I think those things all kind of link up. Then we have another event, the final installment in the series at the end of the month, and that's looking generally at multilateralism and where we're at with that. So I'll introduce our panelists. First, Barry Eichengreen here is one of the world's foremost authorities on international monetary economics and economic history. So his research has spanned exchange rates and capital flows, the gold standard, Great Depression, European integration, and on and on. And he has been with the National Bureau for Economic Research, is a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research, and was a senior policy advisor at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and most importantly, a professor in the economics department here and a board member of IIS. So thank you so much for being here. Then Chris Casey is an analyst in the International Trade and Finance section of Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Trade Division at CRS, the Congressional Research Service. And that is based at the Library of Congress. Is it true you have 4 degrees from Berkeley?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So go through the, BA, MA, JD, and PhD. You couldn't have like a stronger alumni affiliation, and used to organize events in this room, which is very cool to see the trajectory. So his expertise spans history of international relations, international law, economic policy, and human rights. And he's the author of a book called Nationals Abroad, Globalization, Individual Rights, and the Making of Modern International Law. So thanks for being here also. And then Professor Max Ophammer is also our own professor and board member. He's the George Party Junior Professor of International Sustainable Development in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. So his research focuses on environmental and resource economics, energy economics, and applied econometrics. And he has served as a lead author for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and has authored articles in many publications. So we'll have him especially focusing on the impacts of the current moment on climate policy and decarbonization goals. So I will turn it over to you, and there'll be some back and forth, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Jess. And I just want to start this session on a note of sincere gratitude to Jess and to Bennett for making this series on the rupturing of the contemporary international order possible. I'm co-director of the Institute of International Studies, and I can't tell you how happy I am that the Institute is now at the point where events occur without my setting them in motion or taking any responsibility for them. So I'm so grateful to you both for this really wonderful series. Today we're talking about economics, the third in our series of ruptures in the contemporary global order, the rules-based world order, call it what you will. This is the third in the sequence, but I'm enough of a materialist to think that it's actually the most important because economics are foundational of everything else. What I want to start out by doing is asking sort of the panelists to reflect upon a foundational premise that has undergirded the rules-based international order since its inception, though I hesitate somewhat to use that word, since its emergence might be more precise, in the 1940s. This assumption, this premise, holds that the prosperity of the United States and the prosperity of the world economy as a whole are essentially mutually reinforcing, essentially synonymous, perhaps so much so as to be indistinguishable. That proposition is plausibly being today rejected by policymakers in Washington, who are more inclined to see the global economy as a zero-sum game in which growth elsewhere comes at the expense of American firms and workers. So what I would like to do is to invite our panelists, really each of you, though, I mean, we'll direct this more towards Barry and Chris than to Max, who is here to talk more about climate and sustainability. Is that premise broken? Can it be put back together?
Let me start by complimenting Bennett and Jess for the title for the series. If Rupture is not taken, I would like to appropriate it for my next book. It's a great title for encapsulating why we're all here. I think Daniel has summarized the international economic juncture where we're at the moment. The notion after World War II was that international economic relations, open economies that dealt fairly with one another, were engaged in a positive sum game, where what benefited the rest of the world also benefited the United States. So that was the vision at the Bretton Woods conference in 1944. That was the vision that inspired the Marshall Plan in 1947, 1948. And that's the vision that is very much being challenged at the moment. So I think, for example, of the now famous or infamous white paper that Stephen Moran published in November of 2024 on the eve or coincident with the presidential election that took place at that time. Mr. Moran then went on to serve as Donald Trump's Council of Economic Advisors chair, arguably the chief economist in the Trump administration. And now he has been appointed temporarily, I wiggle my fingers, we don't know how temporarily, to a seat on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So he is an influential voice in the Trump administration, and the theme of that white paper was that we're in a zero-sum game with the rest of the world. So that's a more game theoretic academic way of saying America first. That what benefits the rest of the world does not necessarily benefit us. And Mr. Moran talked about the provision of global public goods. He talked about the United States as the source of global liquidity that we provided, the dollars on which international trade and investment run in the 21st century. We did so at considerable cost, in his view, to ourselves. And we needed to get the rest of the world to pay up because we were providing them a global public good for free that they rightly should pay for. And he made much the same argument about global security. His expertise is not global security, but we see that zero-sum view very much popping up in comments about NATO as recently as yesterday or today. Mr. Trump saying that other NATO countries should pay more for our contributions, such as it is to global security. So I think anyone who teaches basic economics knows that teaching the gains from trade, that international trade and international investment in economic theory are a positive sum game, knows that that's one of the hardest concepts to put across to non-specialists. We have to redouble our efforts.
Chris?
Yeah, and I would also like to repeat my thanks for everyone involved in putting together this panel, and also do the requisite federal disclaimer that I'm here in my personal capacity, and nothing I say should be construed as representing the views of the U.S. government or the U.S. Congress. So with that out of the way, I agree with basically everything that was said, with the caveat that so much of the conversation is driven in part by the executive branch and the actions that President Trump and his administration have taken with respect to trade and international security. And, to the extent that there is that his view is broadly held among the other branches, and in particular Congress, is I think somewhat complicated. Certainly, Congress, I think, it could be said has long had a kind of skepticism toward certain elements of the post-war trading system. So, even though there were these delegations of authority to the president that led to trade liberalization, that was sort of constructed in order to combat Congress's own long-standing structural bias in favor of protection. And so, throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, you often saw Congress take a much more skeptical attitude toward trade, but they, sort of sublimated that in favor of, a broader understanding that U.S. prosperity and global prosperity were mutually reinforcing. And so they bought into the larger project, even though there was sort of a skepticism on the district level. And I'm not sure that has changed all that much. I would say I think Congress is about where it was even 10 or 15 years ago in terms of its attitude. It's certainly not as pro-trade as the executive branch traditionally has been since the post-war period, but maybe more pro-trade than the current administration, and I think has been a moderating force in that regard.
That's really, really interesting. Chris, you mentioned that deep skepticism in the legislature about the benefits of free trade is not unprecedented. So I'm curious about how we might situate, the present crisis of U.S. trade policy in historical context. I'm a historian, so maybe I'm too inclined to downplay the urgency or the novelty of current challenges by saying that we've been through this before. But in many ways, we have been through this before. Right, in the early 1970s, the liberal economic system experiences a major crisis, a crisis that is precipitated because American policymakers become convinced that, in Treasury Secretary John Connolly's words, the foreigners have been screwing the United States, and now it's time to screw the foreigners. It's really very Trumpian. The result is a collapse of the gold-dollar exchange standard. And ultimately, the Nixon administration gets what it wants, which is a dollar devaluation that improves the competitive terms of trade for American exporters in a global market. Then 15 years later, you have a much more diplomatic accomplishment of a similar adjustment of exchange rates in the form of the Plaza Accord in 1986. It was 85 or 86? 85, which produces a realignment of exchange rates, again, devaluing the dollar and improving the competitive position of American manufacturers. How would you compare what we're going through today to those two episodes?
I think this is a much more serious historical juncture. I keep using that word. I apologize. In the 1970s, the center held in the sense that we had dual economic, financial, and political crises. That was the era of Watergate, as well as the end of the fixed link between the dollar and gold. How did Watergate play out? Congress stood up and President Nixon was forced to resign. I think we've learned that US political institutions are more fragile than we thought, and that there's been deterioration in their robustness over the half century between then and now. I also think that the stability of economic policy was reasserted by the late 1970s, early 1980s. A Treasury Secretary, Michael Blumenthal, who had talked down the dollar, was fired by Carter. A Federal Reserve chair who didn't understand what was needed in order to fight inflation, G. William Miller, was shifted to another post and replaced by one Paul Volcker. So I think, again, the system survived, the center held in that case, and who knows how current events will play out. But I think we've learned that we could be in a situation that is more fraught than a couple of generations ago.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would qualify that a little bit with respect to trade policy. And so, in one area, I mean, the president has used a number of tools to impose tariffs, the most dramatic of which was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the use of which to impose tariffs, the Supreme Court recently said was unconstitutional. But the other tools that he has used, sections 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, 1962, which authorizes the president to impose tariffs in response to national security crises, and section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the president to impose tariffs in response to certain trade practices that might disadvantage the United States. Those are statutes that have been used quite frequently, and were used quite frequently in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. The section 232 was used almost to launch investigations into a variety of goods almost every year, beginning in the late 50s when its predecessor statute was enacted, all the way up through really the early 1990s is when its use starts to fall off. And similarly, 301 is used many times to impose tariffs or threaten to impose tariffs by the president to put pressure on all sorts of close trading allies. And I mean, we might say that there is a difference in the kind of pretextual nature that might be being asserted, whether or not imports of steel and aluminum from Canada constitute a threat to our defense industrial base is maybe questionable. But in the 1960s, there were investigations on Swiss watch parts for national security reasons, and presumably timekeeping is really important for military purposes, but I'm not sure if I'd have to look into what the Department of Defense said in its the report that it submitted to Commerce on that. But it seems a little bit tenuous. And so the use of the executive branch of tariffs to sort of put pressure in response to constituent pressure or pressure from influential members of Congress who might be putting pressure on the administration is quite, I think has been relatively consistent. The IEPA exception aside, the past year has been, I think, what was exceptional, but with the Supreme Court sort of tamping down on that, where you can see the administration shifting back to those much more legally durable tools. So I would qualify that a little bit in the trade space, not necessarily the.
I have a question for my fellow panelists, maybe. So the one thing I worry about, when we take PhD level macro and micro, we learn that investments in innovation and the productivity of labor are, really well understood drivers of economic growth, both domestically and globally. So this fundamental lack of belief in science and investments in scientific research, compounded with the withholding of funds from K through 12 education, to me strikes me as the other sort of big threat that's not the sort of short run mayhem, but may actually have sort of long lasting effects on the world order and where the US stands in international competitiveness.
Most recently evidenced by the Trump administration's proposed budget with a 55% cut to NSF funding, if I recall correctly.
And under a continuing resolution, you have to work under the president's, proposed budget. So there's all kinds of games one can play there.
It's a really, really interesting point. I mean, when you think about the history of Silicon Valley since the 1970s, you're really dealing with the long-term payoffs of a set of Cold War investments that are made in a relatively, truncated span of time, beginning with the 58 Defense Education Act. Let me ask you, this is another question about the deep sources of American decline, and I do want to orient this towards you, Max. I'm interested to hear what Chris and Barry might have to say too. Among the sources of U.S. ascendancy in the early post-World War II era, you have to emphasize oil. The U.S. in 1945 produces, 2/3 of the world's oil output. Oil is just becoming, the predominant fuel, really beginning to displace coal as the mainstay of, industrial production, or the primary energy source for industrial production. How does the dwindling of U.S. domination of world oil production sort of play into this big narrative of U.S. decline?
So, I mean, I think recently we've actually been producing a whole bunch of oil, right? So that's been sort of a reversal of that trend recently. I mean, oil I'm an environmental economist, so I'm going to take this back in a second, but oil is an amazing resource, right? It's a highly concentrated source of energy. You can transport it. We know how to produce this stuff, ship it around. We've generated the institutions called markets to trade the stuff globally, to, in theory, dispatch it to the places where it's most needed. Granted, markets fail, right? So over time, the stuff is underpriced. We do not charge its full cost on the planetary ecosystem, so oil and its derivatives are relatively cheap. It as a fuel has enabled a run-up of economic growth in the United States and worldwide in sort of unprecedented ways, well, except for coal, did that earlier. But the reason I think oil is interesting from an economic point of view right now is not sort of this fundamental input as to, where does our energy come from that we then use in its various usable forms, but from an economic point of view, oil is interesting. So I don't know where Barry stands on this one. There's a long debate in economics about whether oil price shocks precede recessions or not, and whether that relationship is actually causal, right? Do you get an oil shock that causes a recession and then the world economy dives? So I think we're living through weeks of really crazy oil price volatility. The markets are going along with this. So I think that the question here is, how important is oil to this day as a driver of economic activity, and how predictive is it of future, economic growth and well-being?
Yeah, so my reading of the history is that every major oil shock has precipitated a recession globally and for the United States. And the question is, how much less dependent has the US economy become on oil? History doesn't repeat. What's always been true in the past may not be true in 2026. We're about to find out. The other thing I would observe is that oil prices in the United States are linked to oil prices globally. There are distortions to subsidies that Max mentions, but what goes on in the rest of the world, including in the Strait of Hormuz, is important for how this oil shock plays out. And we've put ourselves increasingly in a corner in the last year and a half, where we rely more on oil, and China relies more on solar and wind and clean energy. Daniel describes the era of the unipolar moment after World War II and the connection to oil that could now be turning itself on its head.
And we always think of oil as this transportation fuel, right? Oil is your fertilizer, it's plastics, it's everywhere in different forms. All the goods you're getting delivered to your homes come to you on diesel-powered trucks. There's limited supply capacity. So sometimes you get a shock at one place in the world, and through like real tightnesses in different parts of the markets, they amplify into really crazy shocks that literally drive the inflation right into your home there.
Let's pivot to monetary issues. I mean, you're all just extraordinarily fortunate, I should emphasize, to be able to hear today from Barry Eichengreen, who really is, among the world's foremost experts on international monetary relations and the US dollar in particular. I think we're all curious, Barry, sort of get your take on the stakes of the present crisis for the dollar's position as the world's dominant currency, the world's reserve currency. Do you worry about, the future of the dollar?
I do worry. I've long been of the view that the fact that the dollar is the dominant global currency, it's the incumbent, if you will, provides no guarantee that this will remain the case indefinitely into the future. As I read the data, that dollar's role in the global economy has been eroding very, very slowly over time. And that's kind of natural insofar as other economies, China, India, are growing faster than the United States. Our US weight in the world has been declining marginally, and the role of the dollar as a reserve currency, as a currency to which other countries peg their own currencies, has been eroding very gradually over time. I don't find that erosion especially alarming. I think the movement toward a less dollar-centric, more diverse monetary and financial system will probably be a good thing for the world if it occurs smoothly in an orderly fashion. The events of the last year and a half raised the prospect that it could occur abruptly in a disorderly way, and disrupting financial markets, disrupting the provision of liquidity for cross-border trade and investment. And the latter would be a bad thing for the United States and the world. So we in the United States benefit from being able to do cross-border business using our own native currency. That's good for our banks and firms. It's easy for us when we play tourist abroad. Convenience value is something. Up until recently, the US Treasury could borrow at a lower interest rate than otherwise because dollars were held abroad by foreign central banks and corporate treasurers and others. That convenience value, it's called, attached to US Treasury bills has kind of gone away now. And the US has benefited from the dollar's safe haven status. Whenever a bad thing affects the global economy, funds rush into the dollar, into US financial markets, and that's a whole lot better than suffering from capital flight when there's a shock to the world economy. So that those safe haven flows did not happen after Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025. Whether they will happen again in the future is an open question. So there could be costs to all of us, to the United States and to the global economy if there's a global shortage of liquidity. Were people to begin to really doubt the consistency and competency of US economic policy, develop doubts about the stability and governance of our financial markets, and I think more importantly, begin to worry about the political underpinnings of dollar dominance, where the political underpinnings are rule of law, checks and balances on the executive, division of powers, control of corruption, about those domestic political foundations of dollar dominance, and about the international political foundations, our alliance politics, the fact that our allies disproportionately hold and use dollars in their international transactions because they trust us. Is the United States still regarded globally to be a trustworthy alliance partner or not? That will have implications for the future of the dollar.
Could I push a little bit harder, Barry, at your point on the political and institutional foundations of monetary order? Look, we all know that, the idea of pristine Federal Reserve independence is a little bit of a myth. The Federal Reserve has been subject to presidential pressure, presidential harangues in the past, but never before criminal investigation by the Department of Justice of the chairman of the Federal Reserve. We're dealing with a different magnitude of presidential meddling. What are the implications for the dollar and the international order?
I think the implications are potentially profound, that Federal Reserve independence has always been contested, but as you say, never to the extent it is today. Previous presidents have occasionally made open criticisms of the Fed, but cautiously and occasionally. And Mr. Trump's tweets about the Fed and Jay Powell are a different order of magnitude. Foreign central bank reserve managers, the people who decide in what currency the Bank of Korea or the Bank of Japan should hold its reserves, pay attention to these matters. And I think the points I made before about separation of powers and respect for independent agencies, that applies directly to the Fed.
Great. While we're sort of on the theme of institutions, before we pivot to audience questions, which I'll do in 10 or 15 minutes, let me ask Chris to elaborate on his sort of earlier observations about executive legislative tension in trade policy. One could argue, and we've had this conversation in the past, that the turn towards liberalization that U.S. trade policy takes in the aftermath of the Second World War is really built upon a kind of compact between executive and legislature, wherein the legislature devolves its constitutional responsibility to adjudicate tariffs to the executive branch. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, in many ways, is a critical foundation of the post-war order. Do you think that bargain is today tenable, or do you see it as coming unstuck?
Yeah, I do agree that like the U.S. approach toward tariffs is essentially a creation of the executive branch in the post-war period. So, as you mentioned, beginning in the 1930s and 1934, Congress began basically authorizing the president to negotiate trade agreements and proclaim changes to tariff rates without further action by Congress. And there are a number of arguments about why Congress at that time decided to do that. It came just a few years after the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which is interestingly the last time Congress has ever affirmatively set a tariff rate. So the last time in any legislation a specific tariff rate was defined was in 1930. And so since then, every reduction in a U.S. tariff rate, all that trade liberalization happened through executive proclamation authorized by Congress, but not codified in statute. But the sort of the bounds of that agreement, it wasn't quite set up entirely with an eye toward trade liberalization. So when Congress delegated liberalizing tariff authority, like in the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act and in subsequent trade promotion authority statutes, it was often closely cabined, right? There are limitations to what the president can do, how much the president can lower tariffs in some of those circumstances later, consultation and notification requirements, and also all of those statutes sunset after a specific period of time. So right now there is no active trade promotion authority that Congress has delegated out. That last expired in 2021. At the same time, they passed a number of statutes that did allow the president to raise tariffs for national security reasons or to respond to trade actions. And so in many ways, they closely cabin delegations of authority that allow for the reduction of tariffs, while not really superintending much the authorities that allow a president to increase tariffs. Now, part of that may have been because of trust that the president would use this power diligently, not compromise the liberal trading order that Congress was clearly kind of interested in setting up. But at the same time, the presidents were using these authorities quite liberally for many decades until really the 1990s, when you see them fall off for a number of reasons, mainly the advent of the WTO and sort of almost a temporary acceptance of the dispute mechanisms there as the way that they wanted things done. But yeah, so I guess I would say that era of trade liberalization, that the agreement between Congress and the president wasn't quite as, liberalizing in its construction. It just was liberalizing insofar as successive presidents, in part because of the interests and the expertise embedded in the agencies that were insulated from political pressures, were interested in trade liberalization. But even there, you do see these trade-offs in the executive branch as like there's departure and shifting of responsibility for trade policy away from the Department of State toward the special trade representative and then the USTR, and shifting other areas of trade regulation to the Department of Commerce. And so, the early part of the liberalization program is very tied up with security in the Cold War context in a way that it's sort of disentangled from a little bit later. And that might actually be what was anomalous, right? Is that there was a period where it was less entangled with sort of foreign policy, national security concerns than it was either in the early decades of the Cold War and arguably now.
So I'm not a trade economist, but it so happens I was reading recently about the Tokyo Round GATT agreement in 1979. So this comes midway through Daniel's crises of the 1970s and 1980s and an ongoing backlash against trade. And that an agreement was reached that the Congress ratified in 1979 was remarkable and important. It was a big cut in tariffs, and it was the first time the GATT addressed non-tariff barriers to trade through codes and so forth. Nobody thought it would pass. And what the Texas lawyer Bob Strauss did to get it passed was he enlisted the Congress. So, they would go off to Geneva to negotiate the cuts and the codes and everything, and he would bring Congress people with him. It was a collaborative effort. They were part of a consultative group. On Liberation Day, I didn't see any consultation.
Now, this is a really, really interesting discussion thread in relation to carbon and climate. Because if you think about the domestic institutional side of US climate diplomacy over the past quarter century, what you see is a almost complete bifurcation. Even administrations that have been inclined to take active international leadership on climate have done so unilaterally without congressional engagement. How severe a threat, Max, is our sort of domestic institutional disorder to this country's ability to lead the world in decarbonization?
So I think I'm not a historian,
No.
but I think that U.S. can lay claim to leadership in many areas.
Yeah.
Climate not being one of them, right? So we've historically stood in the way of progress on climate. Even if you look at Kyoto, late 1980s. Oh my God, 90s. Sorry, yeah, somewhere in there, somewhere in the rearview mirror. It was Clinton, right? And so, went off and said, yes, I'm going to do this, full well knowing that Congress was never going to ratify this agreement. So my take on this is, and this is where I've got to control myself and stick to 90 seconds because I could talk for 3 hours. There's lots of stuff happening right now where we've now repealed the endangerment finding, right? CO2 is no longer a danger to human health or anything. It's just a gas that we breathe out, and we should welcome it, and trees, create sugar from it. But there's a question now that historically one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases no longer has a federal finding that says this is bad for the world. All our decisions go along with that particular, lack of scientific understanding. Internally, it actually creates some kind of interesting legal dimensions here. If a pollutant is no longer a pollutant at the federal level, that means it's not federally regulated. So states could, in theory, do whatever they want, which they couldn't before. So the endangerment finding might actually open quite a bit of opportunity for progressive states to do more. But I think since we're talking about trade, we always say, protectionism bad. In the environmental dimension, there's actually a notion here that was advocated by Bill Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize for a number of ideas, but this being one of them, where you have so-called climate clubs, where not all 210 countries get together and say, we're all going to do something jointly, but you just get the willing together. You agree to either a trading system or a carbon tax, a similar price. And what you then do is you exercise protectionism at the border, meaning if if Daniel is a country that's not regulating carbon and he wants to sell into my market, I'm going to charge your manufacturers my carbon price at the border. So that is a protectionist, action that was always thought to be impossible under WTO. But now that we've loosened up the rules a little bit, there's something called CBAM, which the European Union and there's a couple of other countries in it are starting to actually practice on a variety of commodities to make this happen. So this is happening without the US. US emissions are actually, going down, whether they like it or not. They're trying really hard, but that's the economics of it. But if we're looking at large countries that are taking the leadership role, when I was hired here 22 years ago, I would have said I'll eat my shoe before this will ever happen. But it looks like China is sort of stepping up as the other partner to the European Union in terms of taking the leadership in climate action.
But of course, a critical difference. I don't know if this is a question so much as an observation, but it's worth emphasizing. Critical difference is that China is a unitary state.
Yes.
That is capable of acting in the world as a unitary state.
Yes.
And I think what our discussion of the past 20 minutes has emphasized is that American institutions in many ways are profoundly unequal to the tasks of international leadership that the United States has exercised over the past 70 or 80 years.
Yeah. I think that's right.
Let me ask you sort of a big, kind of concluding question about the future of globalization, and then we'll pivot to audience questions. But I'm really interested to get each of your perspectives on this question. When the term globalization became commonplace in the 1990s, right, there was a tendency, I think, to characterize globalization as an inexorable and non-reversible process, as an almost meteorological force that was driving the world inevitably and inexorably into ever greater interdependence. From the vantage point of 2026, that conception of globalization seems somewhat less credible. The globalization dynamic seems more fragile, more prone to shock and even reversal. What does each of you think that the future of globalization this century is likely to be?
In your question, Daniel, you implicitly offered two different definitions of globalization. So one is deeply interdependent economies and societies. And the other one was ever greater interdependence, progressively greater interdependence over time. So I'm of the view that the first one will survive and the second one no longer exists, that economies remain deeply interdependent, but there is at the same time a backlash against further deepening that interdependence. Sometimes the distinction is made in terms of globalization versus hyperglobalization. Danny Roderick's term hyperglobalization meaning an ever greater interdependence over time, where cross-border trade and financial flows are growing even faster than the world as a whole. So if you look at the data, the era of hyper-globalization ended around the time of the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. But if you look at various measures of cross-border trade, investment, payments, et cetera, they have been growing in tandem with global GDP, more or less, since then. So I think economies are simply depend too much on one another for variety of functions and resources for globalization to for deglobalization to occur. The global economy as we know it is clearly being restructured in a way where other countries are trying to maintain their interdependence without the United States, where the European Union is negotiating, has finalized its free trade agreement with Mercosur, and where the Chinese and Europeans are trying to find some trade accommodation with one another, where the middle powers are thinking about maintaining their trade because they all believe in trade and FDI, and the United States at the moment does not.
Max, trade in oil has been a powerful driver of globalization over the past 80 years. Is the oil era coming to a close, and with it?
I sure hope so. But there's a really cool new paper out there called The End of Oil. If you're not scared of serious mathematics, I would encourage you read it. It's by a gentleman named Brian Kellogg. But I think the bigger question is what replaces oil, right? And many of you probably drive EVs and have solar panels on your roof so you can signal to your neighbors how green you are. But the question here is that supply chain is fundamentally global, right? There are certain rare earths and minerals and materials you need that don't exist everywhere, and you can just go next door and get it out of your yard. You need to get it from elsewhere. There's also the fundamental issue that manufacturing certain things in the United States is extremely expensive for multiple reasons, or think about some of the labor costs in Europe. So we benefit, we always talk about TVs and how cheap they've gone, but if you look at the cost of solar panels, a lot of that drop in prices and the fact that they're manufactured simply depends on the integration of the global supply chain. So if we start putting walls around things and thinking that these things will come back home and we can produce them at a similar cost that we're used to, that's just not going to happen anytime soon or ever. So I do worry in the long run. I do worry about oil prices. People are going to buy more EVs, right? In the short run, that's a good thing. But in the long run, I do really worry about these trade disruptions and what that will do to our long run, rollout of renewable technologies. Might extend oil's life a little.
Chris, you've got a singular vantage point. I don't think anybody here, has the kind of perspective on Washington politics that you have working on Capitol Hill. Is a pro-globalization consensus in American politics restorable? Or do you think that it's broken irrevocably?
Yeah, the word globalization, I think it's an interesting word insofar of how anchored it is to its moment in time in the 1990s, right? So, the greater interdependence of regions, of continents as a process certainly is something with a long history, but like the way in which globalization connotes something that is geographically boundless on the planet, I think is really sort of like reflective of a temporary optimism and a rage for global multilateral institutions basically from like 1992 to 2004 maybe, that I think that was almost more exceptional. And then if you want to think about the post-war period and sort of the gradual integration of an economy that spans almost the entire world. I do think, and it was sort of mentioned earlier, that this pivot almost back to a kind of plurilateral system where the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was initially, right, the United States and some European allies coming together to decide on some trade rules. And they were quite successful at multiple rounds. Almost every 2 years at the beginning, they were able to come up with some trade agreements. By the 60s, I think they had 3 in the 60s, 1 in the 70s, 1 in the 80s, that ended with the creation of the WTO, and not a single successful one after that, right? Once there was a broadening of that institution away from being something that was anchored in countries that often had a variety of maybe similar interests or somewhat similar economies, the need for that kind of consensus that you need in the WTO and in many other multilateral institutions just can't seem to materialize. I mean, this isn't just in the the trade liberalization space, right? You see this with things in the national security space, like export controls, the restriction on the trade in goods that have national security dimensions to them, right? Governed originally by COCOM, which was mainly just the NATO members and a few others. In the 1990s, they expand that into the Wassenaar arrangement and let basically anyone who wants to join, and you get Russia joining, and it seems really great. But again, now it's led to an organization that can't really make any rules because of the need for consensus and the obvious strategic differences there. And so, I mean, I do think that there is a definite future and real interest in integration and economic cooperation, but sort of in a more restrictive box. And that could mean a deepening rather than a broadening. I mean, you do see opportunities and interests to enter into agreements or to try to regulate on areas like labor and environmental standards in a way you just didn't necessarily see 20 years ago. You can even see this in the administration as it's trying to kind of reconstruct its tariffs after the Supreme Court said they couldn't be done under IEEPA. The first investigation that was announced to impose additional tariffs is sort of framed around prohibitions on the imports of goods made with forced labor. And you could certainly see the US trying to enter into, sort of maybe coercing or, beginning to negotiate agreements around expanding those kinds of prohibitions. So yeah, I mean, I do think there's space for that kind of deepening, but maybe in smaller groups.
Great. Well, let me feed in some questions from the audience.
Instead of talking about the decline of the United States, could we have the same conversation talking about the rise of BRICS? In other words, our decline is relative to their rise. And it might be interesting to look at the situation from that point of view.
Well, it's quite there's no God-given reason why per capita GDP in the United States should be a large multiple of per capita GDP in India or China. There's a logic for the emergence of emerging markets as they put in place relevant institutions and market-oriented reforms, that they should begin to catch up to the United States. But so that's the other side of your coin, to be sure. But the panelists are also worried about our self-inflicted wounds.
But they're authoritarian and politically intense governments in BRICS, China, Russia, India. I think the free market would be Brazil. I think South Africa is not that significant. So these authoritarian, politically driven governments make a lot of mistakes all the time. And I think that would discourage people from using their currencies as an international currency, because is politically motivated rather than free market expression.
So two quick responses, and then I will defer to my co-panelists. One is that the literature in the social sciences on the connections between democracy and economic growth is very large. Different people read it in different ways. I read it as strongly supportive of democracy has a positive impact on economic growth. There are people who have looked at democratic transitions from authoritarianism to democracy and detected a strong positive impact on economic growth. And they've looked at the opposite transition and found a negative impact. I find those studies the most convincing because you're holding constant a lot of other features of the economy and society. Everything I said before about the importance for the dollar's global role of checks and balances, separation of powers, rule of law applies to other countries as well, applies to China. So when I went to China last year, I gave the same talk about how every leading international and reserve currency in history has been the currency of a political democracy or republic with a separation of powers. And that's an obstacle to China's aspirations to develop a global role for the renminbi.
Yeah, following on Chris's comments about how when the world incorporated many types of governments, WTO was not able to progress in rounds of talks to liberalize the world more. And following on the displeasure that globalization generates in certain circles, do you think that it was a mistake to incorporate China into the WTO and not punish, maybe not incorporate, but punished its practices as it subsidized many of its manufacturing capabilities? They even stole intellectual property rights from US, European, and other world companies. What's your take? If we, and I'm speaking as a Mexican who is part of the NAFTA, if we made a mistake in making China a member of the WTO that generated this anti-globalization feelings?
I don't really know enough about China to say. I mean, the WTO had many mechanisms to allow the U.S. to voice, dissatisfaction with any particular practices. Right? They had a robust system of dispute resolution that the United States did use in many instances to make complaints, and that it was successful in pushing those cases. I think that there may be a justifiable claim that those processes were often slow and incomplete and difficult and expensive to undertake, given the scale and scope of the allocations about certain Chinese practices. But I'm not sure I could say whether it was a mistake or not. I think there's just a whole lot going on in the 2+ decades since their accession that could have gone differently.
I think it's important to remember that China's ability to export since the 1980s and partly its WTO accession has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty.
Yes.
And that the United States could have done more to protect those who have been disadvantaged by the China shock here at home.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's important to note that like the kinds of trade adjustment assistance that could be provided are usually not linked to the passing of say trade promotion authority bills, right? So, you'll have Congress authorize, the president to negotiate trade agreements or, but not include, Congress doesn't necessarily attach to that the provisioning of trade adjustment assistance.
See, corporations did well then in accepting some of the China's investment agreements that they put on them to transfer technology to China because of the greediness of corporate interest rather than society's interest.
I was going to say something about your point on subsidies. I wonder if they learned the strategic use of subsidies from the US agricultural policy, right? So, I mean, we can't just point the finger over there. We got to look in the mirror, too.
No, true.
Yeah.
But if we believe in rule of law and
It was being intentionally narrow about the use of subsidies and didn't touch the other stuff, yeah.
Farming is a very unique industry.
As an agricultural economist, if I mean, the wealth transfer from California income taxes to farmers in the Midwest through federal tax systems, it just lowers prices that these farmers can charge and moves you down the merit order in international trade. I mean, it's
We
pretty
have
simple.
very steep curves of supply.
Bennett, I think you have a.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Daniel. I've got a question that builds on much, if not most, of what's been said by the panelists, and it relates to this now 6-week war that's in a 48-hour so far ceasefire provision. We'll see how long that lasts. But the coverage in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Bloomberg, elsewhere is just chock-a-block 24/7 of the energy fallout, the broader economic fallout, the relationship between the economic and geopolitical fallout. There's a op-ed in today's Times. I studied the economic fallout from World War I. This could be worse than we expect. That's even as a question, unanswered, that's a huge potential challenge and threat here. So I'm wondering what the panel thinks. I mean, at a minimum, we're seeing a huge demonstration of the vulnerability of oil from the Persian Gulf. We're probably going to see the doubling down, even in a post-Trump administration, of oil production in the US. Yet at the same time, there's an economic and political argument for trying to shift to renewables. China will seize that opportunity, even as it probably depends even more now on coal. And yet there also is the parallel with the pandemic of 2020, 2021, 2022 of massive disruption and realignment of global supply chains, which were not entirely due to the pandemic, but were accelerated significantly by it. So my question is, well, it's too early to tell. We don't know what this war is going to look like tomorrow or next week or next month or thereafter. What do you think are the implications of this war? Of course, depending on its outcome, which nobody could project, on globalization, the international economic order as we've known it over the last 3/4 of a century. It's a huge question we could spend till the cows come home. But I just thought it was important to get this war on the table as a way to crystallize some of the issues the panels addressed.
6 weeks is not, doesn't provide yet a lot of data points. So we know this is a negative shock to the US and global economies. We don't know how big a negative shock. We don't know how long the disruptions to the supply of refined petroleum. It's not simply, getting it onto the tanker that matters, how long that will endure, persist. And the difference from the pandemic is that we don't have the dry powder we had then. Interest rates are higher, budget deficits are larger, public debts are higher.
Yeah, I have a question about the impact of our current administrations, like EPA's, broader policies, especially the repealing of the endangerment fighting, on states' abilities to participate in the global economy, like California, for the world's largest economy. Do we still have waivers? Are we still able to regulate emissions? And how far is this setting us back when it comes to us participating in an energy transition, for example?
Great question, right? I mean, California has always been at the forefront of environmental regulation. Some of it was really smart and really good. Some of it turned out to be hugely expensive and not very good. But I think everybody is still a bit shell-shocked by, how quickly the federal government and how effective they were at removing all the safeguards, right? We focused on the endangerment finding, but this is mercury rules. This is like lead, like keep on, like the stuff we know is really, really bad for everybody. It's okay. All of a sudden. So I think this is the time frame's a little bit longer than the 6 weeks that we've been at war, but people are just sort of sitting back and trying to think about what does reasonable environmental regulation look like. In California, the cap and trade is still operating, right? Nothing's changed. The waiver thing, you know, that you can't issue a waiver for a regulation that no longer exists. So the notion here is how, you know, will this be regulated under the Clean Air Act? This is certainly going to go up to the High Court of the Land, and we'll see what happens. So I think it's much like Barry just said, it's too early to tell what's going to happen. I think if you're reading into California politics, right, we have a gubernatorial election coming up, which is like my German local newspaper is talking about California's gubernatorial election. Last time they did this was when Ronald Reagan ran because an actor became governor. So there's questions there about what this means for California's, you know, priorities going forward. So my reaction is it's not necessarily all bad news for California environmental regulation, but it's also not good news for it.
And sort of a follow-on to that, in the consideration of the rare earths rarity and the manufacture of it, essentially, or purification, mostly in China, can you give us your feeling on, the saying is the solution to high commodities is high commodities. So obviously there's going to be more production of rare earths in other places. Do you have a feel for what that would look like in the United States?
So I mean, I'm not a geologist. We have an amazing geology department. Like they're much better equipped to tell you, you know, what we know. Like we've been looking for oil and coal for a really long time. Some of the stuff we need for battery production, like we haven't been looking for lithium deposits for a very long time. So we're, you know, we're still looking for stuff and learning where it is, but it looks like if you read some of this rare earths literature, a lot of these deposits are in places with not the greatest institutions around, right? Huge concentrations in parts of Africa that have local political struggles. China is one. So God knows, right? What retaliatory behavior will look like in these markets. It would be very easy to withhold, you know, deliveries of certain rare earths in response to some trade sanction that, you know, we get through some executive order. So it's all so, what's the nice word for crazy? Volatile? Is that a good word for crazy? Things are so volatile at this point that I don't have a good answer for you, but the risk is certainly there because we don't have everything we need here in order to make the things we want, right? So we're gonna have to rely on some trade there in some sense, significant sense.
Hi. By the way, I was a researcher at Reed and for Professor Steve Cohen. I read a lot about in this way. I have a couple of questions related to the use of force to control the oil supply. So I used to work at Bank of America in their foreign exchange derivatives group. I met commodity traders, and oil was a commodity. Back after when the Iraq war was going on, people were saying that China doesn't have enough energy to sustain the kind of growth it wanted. I lived in China for 5 years. If you look at the tier 3, 4, 5 cities, they have brownouts all the time, right? When I worked in Korea also, they have to shut down factories in the winter because they needed energy for heating. So I'm wondering if this was a way, if these wars are a way for Trump to kind of stymie the growth of China. I mean, you see this with Cuba, right? Trump says it bluntly, right? Hey, don't bring any oil to Cuba. This is our way of controlling, like, destroying the economy, right? So I wanted to know your thoughts on that. And also, China did build a fiber optic air defense network in Iraq before the Iraq war. Actually, Yeah, so we know they were very keen on controlling the Iraqi oil back then as well. My second question is related to petrodollars. So I grew up in Latin America when the Middle Eastern petrodollars was rushing in. That has a lot of power to swing an economy, whatever way, whatever direction, it feels like going up or down. But we know that the British used force, especially their control of the seas, to invade and seize large gold reserves, like in South Africa, the Boer War, or I think Ghana as well, right? So, and they needed to do this because they needed to maintain the gold standard, which was their way of controlling global trade. And we know with oil is traded in dollars, but more and more countries are relying more on the RMB, right? And I'm wondering if the US sees this as a threat, or the US government sees this as a threat, and this is one of the reasons they are trying to secure the oil supplies around the world to make sure it continues to be traded in US dollars.
So I think you're on your first question, you are imputing too much foresight to the Trump administration. You are imputing to them the existence of a strategy, which I think is going too far as well. They didn't anticipate the closing of the straits. They didn't have an analysis of were the straits to be closed, how would that differentially impact different Asian economies? It's in Asia where they rely most heavily, of course, on oil exported through the straits, where governments have mandated work from home and shut down transportation systems and taken all kinds of steps that would be viewed as radical in the United States. So I don't think anybody in the administration had that in mind. On the petrodollar and all that, there has been for a while a desire to find alternatives to going through the dollar and the US banking system to complete transactions between, say, Saudi Arabia and China. And they've been doing that by building a digital platform. It's called Project Enbridge, and it allows the digital currencies of the 5 participating central banks, 2 of which are the Saudi central bank and the Chinese central bank, to do direct transactions with one another. So it hasn't been scaled up, but it does operate. The code was written in the Digital Institute of the People's Bank of China. And one more observation would be, there's another interesting article in the Financial Times today about Iran's use of cryptocurrencies, actual and prospective, to complete oil market transactions with other countries.
It's called Project Enbridge.
Project Enbridge, yes.
Barry, your mentioning of cryptocurrencies maybe, gives me an opening to pose one really big concluding question, right? I mean, in the university now, we're talking constantly about artificial intelligence and its transformational implications for our research and teaching missions. How is artificial intelligence going to affect the world economic order over the generation to come?
There's no consensus on what artificial intelligence will contribute to aggregate productivity growth. The estimates by the experts are all over the map. They vary by an order of magnitude, so we don't know how global economic growth is going to be affected. And different economies have comparative advantages in different parts of the AI stack. So, we build models, and the Chinese are in a good position to build data centers because they have clean energy, which we where we lag. So that's by way of saying, again, it's too early to tell.
Wasn't it the Federal Reserve that put out that chart that had one of the Federal Reserve banks put out the chart with almost infinite growth, zero growth, like collapse, or like maybe a 1% addition to the GDP is the three options.
Yeah, the Fed calls static dam chart.
Yeah.
The one prediction that I think is where we can say with certainty, it has rocked and will continue to rock electricity markets unlike any other technology that we've seen in the past. I don't know. Yeah, that's it, basically. We've got to look out back decades and decades and decades. Also, this is the Wild West in terms of how these places are allowed to be powered, right? Some places are putting airplane engines on concrete things to power generators, and it is absolute insanity what's happening in that particular space, and there's very little regulation around this as well. So I'm worried not about the productivity effects, I'm worried about the environmental effects of this.
Insanity has been a pervasive theme, that we call it volatility.
Yes.
Great. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Yeah. Chris, you're here for the semester here, or you're here for the